Have you ever been with someone who made you feel like the most special person in the world for about maybe 3 months? You know, someone who came on strong, who pursued you intensely, who made you feel chosen, seen, wanted in a way that you've never experienced before. Someone who said all the right things, who made those romantic gestures, who seemed completely invested in building something real with you. And then just when you started to just kind of relax into that, just when you thought, okay, all right, so this feels real, this person is serious, they started to pull away. Not dramatically, not with a clear ending, just kind of started to fade, become distant, you know, lost interest, stop showing up in the way that they did in the beginning. Left you confused, wondering, you know, what changed? What did I do wrong? How did we go from so intense to so, you know, nothing? And you're not crazy, and you're not alone in that confusion, because we live in a culture that celebrates the beginning of relationships. You know, this chase, the pursuit, the falling, you know, that honeymoon phase. We're obsessed with the spark, the chemistry, the excitement of something new. Even social media is filled with it. You know, the early dates, the romantic gestures, I think I found the one posts. We document beginnings beautifully. We celebrate people who know how to make someone feel special in those first few months. But here's what nobody talks about. Being good at the beginning is not the same as being good at relationships. Being incredible at the first 3 months is not the same as being capable of the next 3 years. And there's an entire category of people, millions of them, who, you know, are absolutely masterful at starting relationships, but completely incapable of actually staying in them. You know, they're not players, they're not running game, they're not intentionally hurting people. They genuinely believe in each beginning that this time is different, that you're special, that they're finally ready. But once the beginning ends, once the excitement fades, once the newness starts to wear off, once it transitions from thrilling to real, they're gone. And not because you did something wrong, not because you weren't good enough, not because, you know, of any of those things, but because they're addicted to something you can't give them forever. And that's the feeling of a new beginning. You know, this is what I call the serial starter pattern. You know, it's one of the most confusing, painful, and exhausting relationship dynamics of our time. If you think about Drake for a moment, one of the biggest artists in the world, you know, this is a man who's built an entire career on understanding romance, on emotional vulnerability, and knowing exactly what women want to hear. He's dated some of the most incredible women on the planet. You know, Rihanna, Serena Williams, Jennifer Lopez, Georgia Smith, multiple models, actresses, successful, beautiful, interesting women. Women that most people would do anything to build something real with. And he couldn't make it work with any of them. Not one. Not because they weren't enough. Not because the connection wasn't there. But because Drake is a textbook serial starter. This is someone who's incredible at beginning, but can't transition to the middle. He knows how to pursue. He knows how to make someone feel special, knows how to create that intense connection in those first few months. But once it starts to get real, once it requires actual partnership, sustained effort, working through conflict, showing up when it's not exciting, he's out. And here's what makes this pattern, you know, so painful. It's not just happening to celebrities and, you know, high profile relationships. It's happening everywhere. It's happening to the person who's been on 50 dates, 50 first dates, let's say, but never makes it past month 3. It's happening to the person who's incredible at the talking stage, but then disappears once things get serious. It's happening to the person who falls hard and fast, makes you believe they're all in, then ghosts the moment you start expecting consistency. And it's happening to the person who's always looking for the next spark instead of building on the current connection. And, if you've ever been on the receiving end of these types of patterns, if you've ever felt chosen and then abandoned, pursued and then ghosted, special then replaceable, that's just a devastating feeling. That's devastating. Because serial daters don't just break your heart, they break your trust in your own judgment. They make you question everything you thought was real. They leave you wondering if the entire beginning was a lie, but it wasn't a lie. That's the thing. It wasn't a lie. That's what makes it so confusing. They're really meant in that moment. They felt it. They believed it. They genuinely believed it. They just can't sustain it because they're not actually building relationships. They're collecting beginnings. And, once you start beginning with them, once you start your beginning with them is over, they're already looking for the next one. If you think about your own life for a moment, think about your own life, reflect on that. Have you ever been with a serial starter, someone who was all in at first but couldn't stay once things got real? And this might be harder to admit here, but have you ever seen the serial starter, or have you ever been the serial starter yourself? Have you ever pursued someone intensely, made them feel special, genuinely believed it was real, and then lost interest once the newness wore off? Because this is not unique to only a selected few. And if you're honest, you might recognize this pattern again in your own behavior, the way you're incredible in the first few months but struggle once things transition to partnership, the way you're drawn to the excitement of someone new but bored by the stability of someone familiar, the way you're always chasing the feeling of falling instead of building something that lasts. And this is the serial starter pattern. Understanding how it works, why people actually get stuck in that type of pattern, what they're actually seeking, and how to break free from it is essential if you kind of want to build real lasting connections instead of just kind of collecting exciting beginnings. Because here's the truth: beginnings are easy, staying is the hard part. And if you can't do the hard part, you'll spend your entire life just starting over and over and over and wondering why nothing ever lasts, why nothing, never realizing that the problem isn't who you're choosing, it's that you're only capable of choosing them for 3 months, sometimes 6 if you're lucky. And this is the serial starter trap. And it's destroying, more relationships than cheating, more connections than distance, more potential than almost any other pattern in modern dating. So let's break it down. Have you ever noticed someone can say "I love you" in a month, but can't say "I'm staying" in 6 months? They'll tell you you're different. They'll say they've never felt this way before. They'll make you believe you're the one they've been waiting for. And then right when you start to believe it, right when you let your guard down and think, okay, all right, so this is real, they're gone. Not with an explanation, not with closure, just distant, faded, just checked out. And you're sitting there thinking, hold on, wait, didn't you just say I was special? Didn't you just say, you'd never felt this way before? What the hell happened? Let me tell you what happened. They weren't lying. They meant every word, but they're addicted to something that you can't give them forever, and that's the feeling of falling. And this is the first truth about serial starters. And if you've ever been one, or if you are one, this will explain everything. The first truth is that serial starters aren't lying when they say you're different. They genuinely believe and feel that way in the beginning, but they're addicted to the beginning or the feeling of falling, not the work of building. So let me break this down like this, because it's the most confusing part of actually dealing with these people. So when a serial starter pursues you, when they make you feel like you're the center of their universe, when they tell you you're unlike anyone they've ever met, they're not running game. They're not manipulating you. They actually mean it. And that's the thing. In that moment, they feel it. They believe it. They're convinced this time is different. The problem isn't that they're lying. The problem is that their feeling in the beginning is the only thing they're capable of sustaining, because serial starters aren't looking for relationships. They're looking for that rush, that high, that the intoxicating feeling of falling for someone new. And that feeling, it only exists in the beginning. That feeling only exists in the beginning. So once you've fallen, once the relationship transitions from thrilling to stable, from new to familiar, the feeling kind of disappears. And for the serial starter, when that feeling is gone, the relationship is pretty much over, even if you're technically still together. So if you think about Drake for a second, this is a man who's dated again some of the most incredible women on the planet. Rihanna, he pursued for years, made grand gestures, professed his love publicly, made her feel like she was the only one who mattered. And then what? The moment it got serious, the moment she wanted actual commitment, he pulled back, not because he didn't care, but because the version of caring he's capable of only exists in the chase, not in the commitment. We got Serena Williams, one of the greatest athletes of all time, successful, very powerful, beautiful, and he showed up strong, made her feel special, and then it was over. Not because she wasn't incredible, not because, but because once the excitement faded, he had nothing left to kind of really sustain that connection. Jennifer Lopez, Georgia Smith, the list goes on. Every single time the pattern is the same. It's this intense beginning, grand gestures, deep feelings, and then nothing. He's not a bad guy. He's not trying to hurt these women. He genuinely feels it in the beginning, but he's addicted to the feeling of falling. And once the falling stops, so does his interest. So now think about your own life. Have you experienced this? The beginning is incredible. They text you all day. You have those deep conversations that last until 3 a.m. They make plans for the future. They pursue you in a way that makes you feel chosen. You think, okay, finally, someone who's serious, someone who's ready, someone who actually cares. But then around the month 3 or 4, something shifts. The texts slow down, the effort decreases, and the intensity fades. They're still there physically, but emotionally, they're just checked out. And you bring it up, you say something, you bring it up and they say everything's fine. They're just busy, stressed, work is crazy. They still care. But you feel it. You feel that energy shift. You feel the energy is different. The person who was so present, so invested, so all in is now distant, distracted, half there. And you're confused, what did I do wrong? How did we go from so intense to so nothing? And here's the painful truth. You didn't do anything wrong. Nothing about you changed. What changed is that the beginning ended. And serial starters are only built for beginnings. They're incredible at the first 3 months. The pursuit, that excitement, the thrill of getting to know someone new. But once it transitions to the middle, once it requires consistency instead of intensity, partnership instead of pursuit, actually showing up when it's boring instead of just when it's exciting, they have no idea what to do because they've never learned how to build. They've only learned how to start. So they do what they always do. They fade. They pull back. They start looking for the next person who can give them that feeling again, not because you weren't enough, but because they're addicted to a feeling that they can't last forever, or that can't last forever, I should say. This is what makes serial starters so dangerous, because they genuinely believe that they want a relationship. They say they're looking for something real. They pursue you like they mean it. But what they actually want is the feeling of beginning a relationship, the excitement, the newness, the intensity. And once that beginning is over, it's a wrap. So is their interest. So if you're the person being pursued by a serial starter, this is exhausting. You open up, because you open up, you invest, and you believe. Naturally, the intensity is real. You start imagining a future, and then they disappear. Not dramatically, they just kind of start to fade. And of course, you're left heartbroken, wondering what did it make, or what you did to make them lose interest. But you didn't do anything. That's the problem. The problem was never you. The problem is that they're only capable of beginnings, and you're no longer a beginning. You're a middle, and they don't know how to do middles. Now, if you're the serial starter, this is equally exhausting. You genuinely want connection. You pursue people who, with real feelings. You believe every time that this is the one, and then 3 months in, you feel it, that boredom, the restlessness, the sense that something's missing. You think there's something wrong with the person that you're with, that they're not right, or that they're not the right fit, that the spark is gone, so you end it or fade until they end it. And you start looking for the next person who can give you that feeling again. New person, intense beginning, genuine feelings, then the boredom, restlessness, the need to start over. And you're not lying. You're not trying to hurt people. You're not a bad person. You genuinely want something real. But the only thing is you're addicted to a feeling that only exists in beginnings. And until you recognize that addiction, until you understand that the boredom you feel in month 4 isn't about the other person, it's about your inability to transition from falling to building. You'll keep repeating this pattern forever. Here's the truth. Most people don't want to hear. Real relationships don't stay in the beginning forever. The intensity actually fades. The newness wears off. The excitement transitions to something steadier, calmer, deeper. And if you're only capable of intensity, if you only know how to function in the excitement of something new, you'll never experience the depth, intimacy, and genuine partnership that just kind of comes after the beginning ends. Serial starters aren't bad people. They're just not, but they're exhausting to love and exhausting to be with. Because they're constantly chasing a feeling that can't be sustained. That's the reality of that. Constantly starting over instead of building deeper. Constantly mistaking the end of the honeymoon phase for the end of the relationship. Drake is almost 40 years old, and he's still running the same patterns, still chasing the same feelings, still starting relationships he can't finish. You don't have to do the same. If you recognize this pattern in yourself, for some of you who's listening, here's what you need to understand. The boredom you feel in month 4, that's not a sign that the relationship is wrong. That's a sign that relationship is transitioning from intensity to intimacy. If you try and see it like that, and intimacy, real intimacy, is where love actually lives. But you'll never experience it if you just keep running the moment that intensity fades. If you've been hurt by a serial starter, here's what you need to know. And I really want you to listen to this. It wasn't about you. You didn't fail. You weren't boring or inadequate. You just stopped being new. The newness is what they're addicted to. That's not a reflection of your value. It's a reflection of their capacity. And this is the first truth. Serial starters aren't lying about their feelings in the beginning. They're just incapable of sustaining those feelings once beginning ends, or once the beginning ends. They're addicted to falling, not building. And until they realize that addiction, they'll spend their entire lives collecting beginnings instead of creating lasting connections. So don't forget to stick around for truth too, guys. As always, stay beautiful, stay connected, and stay conscious in the field. You know what's crazy some people can tell you their deepest secrets on day 2, but can't handle a simple disagreement on month, let's say 4. They'll cry with you, share their trauma, be vulnerable in ways that make you think, wow, this person is emotionally mature. You know, they're not afraid of intimacy. They're ready for something real. And then the first time you actually have a conflict, the first time you need them to actually show up in a way that's uncomfortable, they shut down completely. The person who was so emotionally open in the beginning becomes emotionally unavailable the moment things get complicated. And you're sitting there thinking, hold on, wait, I thought you was emotionally available. You know, you shared everything with me. What happened? Here's what happened. They confused emotional intimacy with emotional depth. And those are two completely different things. This is the second truth about serial starters, as we call them. And it explains why some can seem so emotionally mature at first, but completely incapable of actual partnership later. So the second truth is this. Serial starters make emotional intensity or mistake emotional intensity for emotional depth. They can share their feelings in the beginning, but they can't do the actual work of intimacy when things get complicated. Let me explain it like this, and let me explain why this is so confusing. Because serial starters, what happens is they often seem more emotionally available than most people. And they're not the stereotypical emotionally unavailable person who's cold, distant, or won't open up. They have deep conversations on the second date. They'll share things with you they don't usually tell people. They'll be vulnerable in ways that create instant intimacy. And this emotional openness, it is so intoxicating that you think finally someone who's not afraid to be real, someone who can actually communicate, someone who's emotionally intelligent. But here's the trap. Sharing your feelings when everything is new and exciting is not the same as working through feelings when things get hard. Emotional intensity is not the same as emotional depth. And I'm going to say that again. Emotional intensity is not the same as emotional depth. Serial starters are masters of emotional intensity because they create deep connection quickly. You know, they can create deep connection quickly. They can make you feel like, you know, you make you feel seen and understood in ways that feel rare and special. But that intensity is part of the performance of the beginning. It's part of what makes the falling feel so powerful. You know, because real emotional depth isn't about how vulnerable you are in month 1. It's about whether you stay vulnerable in month 6 when the other person sees your flaws and when you have to work through actual conflict. And that's where serial starters fail completely, because they can perform vulnerability when everything feels good, but they just can't practice vulnerability when things get uncomfortable. Think about Drake's entire discography. You know, the man who talks about his feelings more than almost any male artist out there. Take Marvin's Room, you know, Take Care, Passion Fruit. His music is filled with emotional vulnerability and we love it. You know, he's open about his loneliness, his fears, his desire for connection. And on the surface, it seems like emotional maturity. You know, like someone who understands feelings and isn't afraid to just express them. But listen closely to what he's actually saying. You know, he's not singing about working through conflict. He's not singing about staying when things get hard. He's not singing about choosing someone even when the spark fades. He's singing about missing people after they've gone, about wanting what he can't have, about longing for connection while being unable to sustain it. Look at Marvin's Room. It's literally about drunk dialing an ex, wanting her when she's with someone else. But where was that wanting when she was actually available and asking for commitment? Look at Passion Fruit. That's about being emotionally distant while someone else is trying to connect with him. His entire catalogue is the soundtrack of someone who feels deeply but won't go deep. And that's a difference. You know, someone who wants connection but won't do the work of maintaining it. You know, who's vulnerable about his emotions but unavailable for actual partnership. And this is the serial starter trap. Emotionally expressive but not emotionally consistent. Vulnerable when everything is easy, shut down when things get real. So think about your own experience. What about your own experience? In the beginning, they're incredibly open. They share things about their past, their family, their fears. They have conversations that feel deeper than anything you've experienced in months of dating other people. And this openness makes you feel special. You know, you think this person gets it. They're not playing games. They're emotionally available. So you tend to open up and you share your vulnerabilities. You let them see parts of you that you usually protect. You know, you invest emotionally because they seem invested too. But then when the first real conflict arises, when you have a disagreement, when you actually need them to show up in a way that requires effort, when you express a need to make them uncomfortable, or that makes them uncomfortable, they disappear. Not physically, but emotionally. They shut down, they pull away, they become defensive, even avoid conversation, or even avoid the conversation. You know, the person who was so emotionally available in month 1 is suddenly unavailable in month 4. And you're just left confused. You know, but you were so open in the beginning. Like, you told me you wanted something real. What changed? What happened? And like I said, what changed is their emotional availability. They're only emotionally available in the beginning. You know, what changed is that their emotional availability in the beginning was part of the seduction, not a foundation for partnership. You know, they can share their feelings when everything is easy, but when the conversation is deep but not challenging, you know, when vulnerability creates connection without requiring change, but when vulnerability requires actual work, when it means staying present through conflict, when it means hearing feedback that's hard to hear, when it means showing up consistently, even when it's uncomfortable, they're gone. Because serial starters don't actually want intimacy. You know, they want the feeling of intimacy. And those are two completely different things. You know, the feeling of intimacy is what you get in the beginning. Deep conversations, emotional sharing, vulnerability that creates instant connection. You know, it feels profound. It feels special. It feels like you found someone who really gets you. But actual intimacy is what comes after the beginning. Working through conflict, navigating differences, you know, staying present when the other person's flaws show up, choosing each other even when it's hard. And that kind of intimacy requires emotional consistency, not just emotional intensity. It requires showing up when it's uncomfortable, not just when it feels good. It requires doing the work, not just performing the vulnerability. But serial starters, they can't actually do that. They can feel intensely, but they can't work consistently. They have to share, you know, they can share vulnerable or be vulnerable, but they can't stay present through difficulty. So when the relationship transitions from feeling based to work based, when it requires actual partnership instead of just emotional intensity, they actually check out. Not because they're bad people, I'm not saying that, but because they're mistaken emotional expression for emotional maturity. They think because they can talk about their feelings, they're ready for a relationship. But talking about your feelings in the beginning, that's the easy part. The hard part is staying emotionally present when those feelings get complicated, when your feelings conflict with your partner's feelings, when being in the relationship actually requires you to grow, change, compromise, show up differently. Now that's when serial starters disappear. Think about how this plays out in your own life, in your life. Maybe you're dating someone who seemed so emotionally available at first, shared deeply, made you feel understood, you know, who created intimacy very quickly. But now, months in, when you try to have a difficult conversation, they kind of shut down. When you express a need to, you know, they get defensive. When conflict arises, they pull away instead of working through it. And you're left wondering, where did that emotionally open person from the beginning go? The answer, that person only exists in the beginning. Because again, the emotional openness was never about building partnership. It was always about creating intensity. And once that intensity requires, and once intensity requires work, they're out. Maybe you recognize this pattern in yourself. Maybe you're the serial starter. You're great at deep conversations in the early stages. You can be vulnerable and share your feelings, create connection quickly. But when the relationship gets to the point where vulnerability requires actual change, where your partner needs something from you that's uncomfortable, where conflict arises and you have to stay present through it, you shut down. You tell yourself this relationship isn't right. The person isn't right, or isn't the right fit. That something's missing. But what's actually missing is your capacity to transition from emotional intensity to emotional consistency, from performing vulnerability to practicing intimacy. And this is why serial starters often have incredible chemistry with people, but can't last or build lasting relationships, because chemistry is about intensity. Relationships are about consistency. Chemistry is about how you feel in the moment. Relationships are about how you show up over time. And if you're only capable of intensity, you'll have incredible beginnings with people. Yes, you will, but you'll never make it to the middle where real intimacy lives. Here's what you need to understand. Emotional availability in the beginning is not the same as emotional maturity in the middle. Sharing your feelings when everything is new is not the same as working through feelings when things get complicated. Real emotional depth isn't about how open you are on date 3. It's about whether you can stay open on month 6. When the other person sees your flaws and when you have to work through conflict instead of, just feeling connection. And if you can't do that, if you can only be vulnerable when it's easy and shut down when it's hard, you're not emotionally available. You're emotionally performative. Like Drake can write entire albums about his feelings, but he can't stay in a relationship past the honeymoon phase, because emotional expression without emotional consistency is just performance. And no amount of deep conversations in month 1 will create a lasting relationship if you can't stay emotionally present in month 6. So this is the second truth. Serial starters mistake emotional intensity for emotional depth. They can share their feelings in the beginning, but they can't do the actual work of intimacy when things get complicated. And they're masters of performed vulnerability, but incapable of practice partnership. That's a wrap for Truth 2. Stay tuned and look out for Truth 3, guys. And as always, stay beautiful, stay connected, and stay conscious in the film. So let me ask you something that might hurt. When they moved on to someone completely different from you in, say 3 weeks, did you torture yourself trying to figure out what she had or he had that you didn't? You checked out their social media, compared yourself, you analyzed every difference. She's more outgoing than me. Maybe that's what they wanted. She's more laid back. Maybe I was just too intense. She's completely different. Maybe I was never their type even. And you just drove yourself crazy trying to understand, what does she have or he have that I don't? What's so special about her? Why her and not me? Here's the painful truth, and it has nothing to do with her. And it has nothing to do with you even. She's not better than you, or he's not better than you. She's not more capable. She's not more their type. She's just new. And the newness is the drug that they're pretty much addicted to. And this is the third truth about serial starters. And it's the most devastating one to accept, because the third truth is this. Serial starters aren't looking for a person. They're looking for a feeling. And once you start providing that feeling of newness, you become replaceable, no matter how incredible you are. Let me break it down like this and why it's so painful. Because When a serial starter is into you, when they're making you feel special, chosen, you think it's about you, about who you are as a person, about your connection, your compatibility, your unique qualities. But it's not. They're not falling for you. They're falling for the way you make them feel in those first few months. That excitement, the newness, the validation of being wanted by someone new, the thrill of someone actually seeing them. Sorry, the thrill of someone seeing them, choosing them, being fascinated by them. And as long as you're providing that feeling, as long as you're new, as long as the mystery is still there, as long as the excitement hasn't worn off, you're valuable to them. But the moment that feeling starts to fade, the moment you're no longer new, the moment the relationship starts to transition from thrilling to familiar, you become replaceable. And not because you're not incredible, not because you did anything wrong, but because there was never really actually building a connection with you as a person. They were just chasing a feeling that you happened to provide temporarily. And when you stop providing it, when you become this familiar person, when the mystery is gone, when the excitement of newness wears off, they find someone else who can give them that feeling. And this is why serial starters can move so quickly or move on so quickly. Why they can go from you're the one to dating someone new in a matter of weeks. And why they can replace you when someone who seems more or seems completely different from you, because it was never about you specifically. It was about the feeling, and anyone new can provide that feeling temporarily. If you think about Drake's dating history, he's been with women who are incredibly different from one another. Rihanna, global superstar, edgy, independent, powerful. Even Serena Williams, an athlete, focused, driven, dominant in her field. Jennifer Lopez, entertainer, I should say, glamorous, established, older than him. Georgia Smith, a young artist, emerging, vulnerable, someone he could mentor. These women have almost nothing in common, though. Different careers, different personalities, different looks, different backgrounds, different ages. The only thing they had in common, they were all new to him at some point. They all provided that feeling of excitement, of possibility, of beginning something fresh. And once that feeling faded with each of them, he moved on. Not to a specific type, but to whoever was next, whoever knew was next, I should say, because he's not looking for a person. That's not what he's doing. He's looking for a feeling, and any new person can provide that feeling temporarily. And this is the most painful part of the serial starter pattern, especially if you're the person being left behind. You think, what does she have or he have that I don't? What's different about her? Why her and not me? You torture yourself trying to find out or figure out what you lacked, what you could have done differently, how you could have kept their interest. But the truth is, you didn't lack anything. The person they moved on to isn't better than you. She's not, or he's not more capable with them or compatible with them, I should say. She's not more their type. She's just new. It's just as simple as that. And newness is the feeling that they are addicted to. If you could see 3 months into the future, you'd see that they'll lose interest in her too, or him too. Not because she's not incredible, but because she's, no longer new. And then they'll move on to the next person, and the cycle will just keep repeating itself. And it's not, it's not about you. It's not even about them, really. It's about the feeling. No person can stay new forever. Now think about your own experiences with this pattern. Maybe you've been replaced by a serial starter. They made you feel special, chosen, like you were exactly what they've been looking for. And then suddenly they were with someone else, someone who seemed completely different from you. And you tortured yourself trying to understand what went wrong. What did I do wrong? What does she have that I don't? How did I lose them? But you didn't lose them. You were never actually, or they were never actually yours to lose, because they were never building something with you as a person. They were chasing a feeling that you provided temporarily. And when that feeling faded, they just moved on. Not because you weren't enough, but because their addiction is to something, is to the feeling of newness, and you were no longer new. Or maybe you recognize this pattern in your own self. Maybe it's you. Maybe you've moved on from incredible people who loved you, who were compatible with you, who wanted to build something real with you. And each time you told yourself, they're not the right fit, something's missing, I need to find someone I'm more compatible with. But if you're honest with yourself, if you're keeping it real, you might recognize that what was missing, what wasn't actually about them. It was about the feeling. The excitement of newness had worn off. That's what it was. And without that excitement, you felt bored, a bit restless, like something was wrong. So you moved on to the next person. And again, for the first few months, it felt right. The excitement was back. The feeling was there again. You thought, this is it. This is the person I've been looking for. But then a few months in, same feeling returned. The boredom, the restlessness, the sense that something's missing. And what happens? You moved on again and again and again, each time believing you're looking for the right person. Never really realizing that you're not actually looking for a person, you're looking for a feeling. And that feeling only exists in beginnings. And this is why serial starters often have just a long history of relationships that all follow the same pattern. Intense beginning, genuine feelings, and then nothing. Move on to the next person. Repeat, rinse, repeat, rinse. And the thing is, they're not even commitment phobic in the traditional sense anyway. They could commit to the beginning. They could be all in for the first 3 months, but they just can't commit to the middle, the part where the excitement fades and what's left is just partnership, building a life together, showing up consistently, working through the boring parts, because they're addicted to a feeling that just doesn't exist in the middle and only exists in the beginning. So they keep starting over, keep chasing that feeling with new people, never really realizing that the problem isn't who they're choosing, it's that they're incapable of staying once the choosing is done. Here's what makes this pattern so tragic. Serial starters often let go of incredible people, really good people who were compatible with them, people who loved them genuinely, people they could have built amazing lives with, but they let them go because they weren't new anymore, because the feeling had faded, because they were bored. And they move on to the next person thinking this time it will be different, this person is more compatible, this is the real thing. But it's not different, because again, the problem was never the person they were with. The problem is their addiction to the feeling. Drake has let go of women that most people would do anything to build a life with. I mean, come on, women who were beautiful, successful, interesting, compatible with him. But he let them go. Not because they weren't enough, but because they stopped being new. And without newness, he has nothing to hold on to, really. Same could be true for you, either as a person being left by a serial starter or as the serial starter yourself. If you're the person being left, it's not about you. And I really want you to know that you didn't fail. You weren't inadequate. You weren't boring or not interested enough, or not the right fit. You just stopped being new, and that newness is what they're addicted to. So no person can provide that forever. I mean, think about it. But if you're the serial starter, the incredible people you've let go weren't the problem. The boredom you left or felt wasn't because, they were wrong for you. It was because you're addicted to a feeling that only exists in the beginning. And have you never learned how to appreciate what comes after that? And until you recognize that addiction, until you understand that the restlessness you feel in month 4 isn't about the person you're with, it's about your inability to transition from the excitement of falling to the depth of building, you'll just keep repeating this pattern forever. You'll keep letting go of incredible people, keep starting over with new people, keep chasing a feeling that can't be sustained, keep wondering why nothing ever lasts, never realizing that the problem isn't who you're choosing, it's that you're only capable of choosing them for as long as they're new. But here's what I want you to understand. Here's what I need for you to understand. If you've been replaced, it wasn't because the new person is better. I need you to understand that is because she's new, you know. And if you're the one replacing people, it's not because they weren't right for you. It's because you're addicted to the feeling that can't last, really. This is the third truth. Serial starters aren't looking for a person. They're looking for a feeling. Once you stop providing that feeling of newness, you become replaceable, no matter how incredible you are. The addiction isn't to you, it's to the high of beginning something new, and that high doesn't last. So stay tuned for the next video where we talk about alignment, okay? And as always, stay beautiful, stay connected, and stay conscious in the field. So here's where we are. You just learned 3 truths about serial starters that explain everything. All right, so we got 1, they're not lying when they say you're different. You know, they genuinely feel that way in the beginning, but they're addicted to the feeling of falling, not the work of building. 2, they mistake emotional intensity for emotional depth. They can share their feelings when everything is just easy, but they can't do the actual work of intimacy when things get complicated. You know, we got 3, they're not looking for a person, they're looking for a feeling. And once you stop providing that feeling of newness, you become replaceable, no matter how incredible you are. These 3 truths work together to create one of the most exhausting patterns in modern relationships. The addiction keeps them chasing beginnings. The intensity tricks them into thinking they're building depth, and the focus on feeling prevents them from actually valuing the person. And in that space between these forces, real connection just becomes impossible, replaced by just this endless cycle of starting, fading, and starting over. But here's what you need to understand. This doesn't have to be your story forever. Whether you've been hurt by a serial starter or you recognize patterns in yourself, there is a way out, and it starts with understanding what's really happening beneath the pattern. You know, serial starters aren't bad people. That's not what we're saying. They're not trying to hurt anyone. They genuinely want connection, but they've confused the beginning of the relationship with the relationship itself. So they think the intensity of month 1 is what love feels like. So what they do is when that intensity starts to fade, in month 4, they think the love is gone. They think the excitement of someone new is what connection is. So when that excitement wears off, they think, you know, the connection is broken. They think the feeling of falling is what relationships are supposed to feel like forever. So when that falling stops, they think the relationship is over. But that's not how real relationships work. You know, real relationships don't stay real relationships don't stay in the beginning forever. The intensity, of course, fades. The newness wears off. The excitement transitions into something more steadier, calmer, deeper. And that transition from intensity to intimacy, from falling to building, from new to familiar, is where real love actually begins. But the serial starters, they never make it there because they mistake the end of the beginning. They mistake the end of the beginning for the end of the relationship. So they leave, or they fade, or they emotionally check out while physically staying, and they start to look for the next beginning. You know, the next person who can give them that feeling again. But not because the person they're with wasn't enough, but because they're incapable of actually appreciating what comes after the beginning ends. And now, if you've been hurt by a serial starter, here's what you need to understand. First, it wasn't about you. You didn't fail. You weren't boring. You weren't inadequate. Okay? You just stopped being new. That's all. And they're addicted to the newness. That's not a reflection of your value. It's a reflection of their capacity. And second, you can't keep someone who's only equipped for beginnings anyway. No amount of staying interesting, staying exciting, staying new will make them stay, because the problem isn't that you stop being interesting. It's that they're incapable of appreciating the middle. Third, stop trying to be chosen by people who are only capable of choosing you temporarily. You deserve someone who can actually build with you, not just fall for you. Someone who values depth, not just intensity. Someone who stays when the newness wears off. And then 4, watch for the pattern early as well. Serial starters reveal themselves if you know what to look for. They come on incredibly strong. They create intense connection very quickly. They make grand gestures and big promises early on. And then around month 3 or 4, they start to fade. The effort starts to decrease. The consistency wavers, as they say. They become distant. And if you see this pattern, don't blame yourself. Don't try harder to keep their interest. Recognize that you're dealing with someone who's only capable of beginnings, and decide whether you want to invest in someone with that limitation. Fifth, require consistency, not just intensity. Don't be impressed so easily by someone who's, amazing for 3 months. Be impressed by someone who's still showing up in month 6, month 12, year 2. Anyone can be intense in the beginning. Real partnership is about who can be consistent in the middle. And if you recognize that the serial starter pattern in yourself, here's what you need to understand. First, the boredom that you feel in month 4 isn't about the person you're with. It's about your addiction to the feeling of newness. Every time you felt that restlessness, that sense that something's missing, that desire to move on, it wasn't because the person was wrong for you. It was because the newness had worn off and you don't know how to function without it. And second, you're not actually bored with them. You're bored with the absence of intensity. There's a big difference there. Being bored with someone means they're not interesting. They're not, not compatible, not right for you. Being bored with the absence of intensity means you're addicted to a feeling that can't last. And you've just mistaken the end of that feeling for the end of the relationship. And third, the person you're with isn't the problem. Your expectations are. You're expecting the beginning to last forever. You're expecting constant excitement, constant newness, constant intensity, but that's just not how relationships work. The beginnings actually end, the excitement fades, and what's left is partnership, which is a lot deeper, more meaningful, more fulfilling than intensity, but only if you're capable of appreciating it. Fourth, start practicing staying. So the next time you feel that restlessness, the boredom, the desire to move on, don't. Stay, kind of sit with the discomfort for a bit, work through it, see what's on the other side of the urge to leave. You might discover that the boredom isn't actually about the person, it's about your discomfort with the transition from falling to building. And if you can just push through that discomfort, you might discover a depth of connection you've never experienced because you've never stayed long enough to actually find it. And fifth, redefine what you're looking for. Stop chasing the feeling of falling. Start building the capacity for staying. Stop seeking intensity. Start appreciating consistency. And stop looking for someone who gives you the high of newness. Start valuing someone who can actually build depth with you over time. And this requires a fundamental shift just in how you approach relationships. It means recognizing that the excitement of month 1 isn't the relationship, it's the audition. You can see it like that. The relationship begins when the excitement starts to fade and you have to choose each other anyway. It means understanding that boredom in month 4 isn't a sign to leave. It's a sign that you're just transitioning from chemistry to partnership. And partnership is where real intimacy lives. It means accepting that no person will stay new forever. And if newness is what you need to stay interested, you'll spend your entire life starting over, never experiencing the depth that comes from actually building something. So here's a practice to start with. Next time you're in the early stages of a relationship with someone new and you feel that intense connection, that excitement, that sense of this is it, just pause and ask yourself, am I falling for this person or am I falling for the feeling of falling? Am I building connection with who they actually are, or am I high on the newness of it all? And then commit to staying past the point where the newness wears off. Commit to month 6, month 12. Commit to seeing what's there when the intensity fades. You might discover that without the distraction of intensity, you actually see the person clearly. And you might find that building with them is more fulfilling than falling for them ever was. Or, you might discover that you genuinely aren't compatible, that the relationship doesn't work beyond the beginning anyway. And that's okay too. But at least you'll know it's actually about compatibility, not just about your addiction to newness. The goal isn't about, the goal isn't to force yourself to stay in relationships that just don't work. That's not the goal. The goal is to develop the capacity to stay long enough to know whether they work, instead of leaving the moment the high of newness wears off. And this isn't easy. If you're a serial starter, the urge to leave when things get boring will be strong. The pull towards new or someone new will feel irresistible. The belief that this person isn't right for me will actually feel true. But you've got to recognize that that's the addiction talking. That's your nervous system seeking the high it's used to. That's your pattern trying to just repeat itself. And the only way to break that pattern is to stay when everything in you wants to leave, to build when everything in you wants to start over, to appreciate depth when everything in you is craving intensity. This is the work, and it's hard, but it's the only path to real, lasting connection. Because the truth is, you can spend your entire life collecting beginnings. You can have 100 intense 3-month relationships. You can experience the high of falling over and over and over, but you'll never really experience real intimacy. Not real partnership, not depth, because those things only exist in the middle, the place where you keep leaving before you actually get there. Drake is almost 40 and he's still running the same pattern, still chasing the same feeling, still starting and never finishing. He's one of the biggest artists in the world. He's incredibly successful. He's talented, wealthy, famous, but he's alone. Still collecting beginnings, still unable to build anything that really lasts. You don't have to do the same. You can choose differently. When you can develop the capacity to stay. You can learn to appreciate what comes after the beginning ends. But it requires you to recognize the pattern. You've got to recognize that pattern to face your addiction to newness, to sit with it, to sit with the discomfort of boredom instead of just running, to choose building over falling. That's where your freedom is. That's where real connection lives. That's where you finally stop exhausting yourself and everyone around you with endless beginnings that go nowhere. The question is, are you willing to do the work? Are you willing to stay when the excitement fades? To build when the falling is over? To see what's possible in the middle instead of constantly chasing new beginnings? Because if you can develop that capacity, everything changes. You stop breaking hearts, you stop getting your heart broken. You stop wondering why nothing ever lasts, and you start building something real, something deep, something that fulfills you in ways that intensity never could. This is the path beyond the serial starter pattern. Not a path where you force yourself to stay in relationships that don't work, but a path where you develop the capacity to know whether they work, because you've actually stayed long enough to see what's there when the newness wears off. Next video coming up is Ascension, guys, where we move towards how we ascend. Okay, so stay tuned for that. And as always, stay beautiful, stay connected, and stay conscious in the film. All right, so let me paint you a picture of what freedom actually looks like, and not the surface level version of where you're just dating someone new again, riding the same high, telling yourself that this time is going to be different. I'm talking about real freedom, the kind where you wake up next to someone you've been with for, say, 2 years, and you feel more connected to them than you did in month 2. The kind where you have disagreements, and instead of pulling away, you work through it and you come out closer on the other side. The kind where your partner isn't fascinating every single day, where the relationship isn't exciting every single moment, but you choose them anyway because you've built something that matters more than excitement. And this is what becomes possible when you finally just break free from the serial starter pattern, when you develop the capacity to stay instead of just start, to build instead of just fall, when you appreciate depth instead of just chasing the intensity. And I want to show you what this transformation actually looks like, because imagine if Drake's incredible capacity for emotional expression, all that vulnerability, all that feeling, all that understanding of romance, what if he transformed from transformed it from a tool of seduction into a foundation for partnership? If his vulnerability became about staying present through difficulty instead of just creating connection in the beginning, if he discovered that the depth available in year 2 with someone is far more fulfilling than the intensity of month 2 with someone new, this shift wouldn't erase his capacity for romance or passion, but it would transform it into something sustainable, something that could actually build a life instead of just starting relationships that go nowhere. And the same possibility awaits you as well. Whether you're recovering from being hurt by a serial starter or recognizing that, the pattern is in yourself. When you break free from that addiction, the newness, the addiction to newness, when you develop the capacity to appreciate what comes after the beginning ends, when you actually learn the value to value consistency over intensity, your entire experience of relationships transforms, because you stop exhausting yourself with endless beginnings. Stop breaking hearts, including your own, because you don't come out unscathed. You stop, wondering why nothing ever lasts, and you start building something real, something deep, something that fulfills you in ways that intensity never could. If you think about what this looks like in your actual life, if you've been hurt by a serial starter or serial starters, you stop attracting them because you start requiring consistency early on. You stop being impressed by the intensity and actually start watching for follow through. You stop investing in people who are capable or only capable of beginnings, and you start to recognize the earliest signs. The person who comes on a bit too strong, too fast, who creates instant or intense connection immediately, who makes big promises in the first few weeks. And instead of being swept up by all of that, you think, hold on, this is nice, yeah, but let's see if they're still here in month 6. And also you stop blaming yourself. When people can't stay, you stop blaming yourself. You stop wondering what you did wrong. You stop trying to be interesting enough to keep someone who's only capable of temporary interest. And you start actually building with people who have the capacity for depth, who value consistency, who can appreciate you in month 12 as much as they did in month 1, not because you're still new, but because they've developed the maturity to value what you've built together. Imagine being with someone for 6 months and feeling more secure, not less, more connected, not less, more excited about the future that you're actually building with this person, not less interested because the newness is worn off. Imagine your partner seeing you at your worst, stressed, tired, not at your most fascinating, and choosing you anyway, not because you're performing for them, but because they value the partnership that they've actually built with you. And imagine conflicts that bring you closer instead of pushing you both apart, because you're with someone who can work through difficulty instead of running from it. And this is what becomes possible when you just stop accepting these serial starter behaviors. When you require consistency, when you value depth over intensity. And even if you recognize the serial starter pattern in yourself, you stop running, you stop starting over every single time the excitement fades. You stop mistaking the end of intensity for the end of compatibility. And you start staying through the boredom, through the moments where your partner isn't fascinating. through the transition from falling to building. And then you discover something you've never experienced before. You discover real intimacy, the kind that only exists when you've stayed long enough to actually build it, the kind that can't exist in beginnings because it requires time, consistency, and the willingness to be seen, fully seen. You discover that the depth available in year 2 is more fulfilling than the intensity in month 2, because the partnership is more meaningful than pursuit. That building a life with someone is more satisfying than constantly falling for new people. Imagine being 1 year into a relationship and still waking up grateful. Not because your partner gives you that high of newness every day, but because you've built something together that matters to you. Imagine having a boring Tuesday, no excitement, no intensity, just regular life, and feeling content, not restless, not looking for the next thing, just present with what you've built. And imagine your partner seeing all of you, the parts that aren't exciting, the flaws, the ordinary moments, and staying anyway. And you doing the same for them as well. Not because you're forcing it, but because you've discovered that real love lives in those ordinary moments, not in the extraordinary beginnings. Imagine looking back at all the incredible people you almost let go of because, they got boring, or, in month 4, and then realizing that boredom was never about them. It was about your addiction to a feeling that can't last. Imagine feeling grateful that you finally stayed long enough to discover what comes after the boredom. Depth, intimacy, partnership, real love. And this is what becomes possible when you just kind of break free from the serial starter pattern. You stop being enslaved to the need for newness. The restlessness that used to drive you towards the next person loses its power. And you can feel it, you feel it, acknowledge it, and choose to stay anyway, because you've learned that what's on the other side of that restlessness is worth more than the temporary high of starting over. You become the person who can actually build lasting relationships, not because you found the perfect person who keeps you constantly excited, but because you've developed the capacity to appreciate what comes after the excitement fades. Let me be clear, this doesn't mean you'll never feel attracted to other people. It doesn't mean you'll never feel the pull towards newness. It doesn't mean relationships will always be easy or exciting. It just means that you'll have the maturity to recognize those feelings for what they actually are. The pull of an old pattern, not a sign that the relationship is wrong. And you'll have the strength to choose depth over intensity, building over falling, staying over starting. Here's what this looks like practically. You're in month 4 with someone new, or with someone. The excitement fades. It started to fade. You feel that familiar restlessness, the voice that, says to you, something's missing. But instead of listening to it, instead of ending things, instead of starting to look for someone new, just kind of pause. You ask yourself, all right, so is this actually about them, or is this about my addiction to newness? And you choose to stay, not forever, just long enough to see what's on the other side of that restlessness. And you discover something. The restlessness passes, and what's underneath is something you've never experienced before, a deeper connection, real intimacy, the beginning of actual partnership. And you realize that what you thought was boredom was actually just the absence of intensity, and beneath that absence is something far more valuable, depth. This is the path beyond the serial starter, not a path where you force yourself to stay in relationships that don't work. That's not what we're saying. But a path where you develop the capacity to know whether they work because you've stayed long enough to see what's there when the newness wears off. Not a path where you settle for boredom, but a path where you discover that what you thought was boredom was actually just that transition from intensity to intimacy. And intimacy is where real love lives. Not a path where you give up, excitement, but a path where excitement becomes one ingredient in the relationship. But the only ingredient you're capable of, not the only ingredient you're capable of appreciating. The truth is, the serial starter pattern, it's exhausting for you and for everyone else involved in it. You know, it's exhausting to constantly start over, to always be in the beginning, you know, never experience what's possible in the middle and beyond. Exhausting to break, you know, to break hearts, including your own, to let go of incredible people because they've stopped being new. You know, to wonder why nothing ever lasts, why never recognizing that you're the common denominator. Exhausting to be addicted to a feeling that can't be sustained. You need constant newness to feel alive, to be able to appreciate what's right in front of you because you're always looking for the next thing. But you don't have to stay exhausted. You can choose differently. You can develop the capacity to stay, to build, to appreciate depth, to value consistency, to see the transition from intensity to partnership, not as the end of the relationship, but as the beginning of something deeper. So this week, I'm going to challenge you. I want to challenge you to notice your patterns around beginnings and staying. You know, if you've been hurt by a serial starter, if you notice if you're still attracted to intensity over consistency. If you're still impressed by people who come on strong instead of people who show up steadily. If you're still giving chances to people who can't stay just because they're good at starting and choose differently, require consistency. Watch for the follow through, or watch for follow through, I should say. Value depth of intensity. If you recognize the serial starter pattern in yourself, you know, notice the moment the restlessness hits, the moment you start feeling bored, the moment you start thinking about moving on. And instead of running, stay. Sit with that discomfort. Ask yourself, is this actually about the person, or is it about my addiction to newness? And then choose to stay long enough to find out. Not forever, just long enough to see what's on the other side of that urge to leave. And you might discover that what you thought was incompatibility was actually just the end of intensity. And what comes after intensity, if you stay long enough to experience it, is far more fulfilling than another beginning could ever be. And remember, being incredible at beginnings is not the same as being good at relationships. Being able to make someone feel really special for 3 months is not the same as being able to build a life with them. You know, real love isn't about how intensely you start. It's about whether you can stay when the intensity fades. It's about whether you can build when the falling is over. It's about whether you actually value the person or just the feeling they give you in the beginning. Drake's a master at beginnings. He knows exactly how to make someone feel chosen, special, and seen. He's built an entire career on understanding romance and emotional connection, but he's almost 40 and still alone, still starting and never finishing, still chasing a feeling that can't last. You know, it just can't last. Still letting go of incredible people because they've stopped being new. You don't have to follow that path as well. If you're the serial starter, you can choose depth over intensity, building over falling, staying over starting. That's where real love lives. That's where genuine partnership exists. That's where you finally stop exhausting yourself and everyone around you with endless beginnings that never go nowhere. The power was never in being good at starting. It was always in developing the capacity to actually stay. And that capacity, that maturity, that depth, that ability to appreciate what comes after the beginnings is available to you now. You just have to choose it and keep choosing it. And every time that restlessness hits, every time the newness wears off, every time your pattern tries to repeat itself, choose to stay, choose to build, choose depth. That's where your freedom is. That's where real connection lives. That's where you finally experience the fulfillment that intensity promised but could never deliver. Stop collecting beginnings. Stop starting and stop building. Stop collecting beginnings. Start building something real. That's where your life actually begins. All right. So stay tuned for the next video. And like I always say, guys, stay beautiful, stay connected, and stay conscious in the field.